Hello, and welcome to this episode of SelfKind with me, Erica Webb. Today we are continuing on our discussion of, are you a HSP, a highly sensitive person? We're going to dive into a little bit more around how to know if you're a HSP, whether or not that trait can kind of appear later in life, and talk a little bit about my experiences as well, and then give you a bit of an idea of where we're going to go with this series. So all of that is coming up. So I have been absolutely loving the interaction that I've been getting over on Instagram as I've been talking more about this whole notion of being a highly sensitive person. I spoke a little bit last week on last week's episode about how I very unsurprisingly discovered that very, very many of my clients are HSPs, and no doubt loads of you listening as well. I think that we tend to find each other, and so I'm really glad you're here. And there's been lots of questions coming through on Instagram and lots of sharing and lots of curiosity and lots of, oh my gosh, me too. And I'm finding that to be a really wonderful conversation. And I wanted to bring some of the questions here to the podcast because I love answering questions. I love thinking about it and then kind of posing them to you as well and saying, what am I missing here? What can you share about your experiences? So I wanted to answer really just two questions that came from Instagram on this episode, but then we're going to dive into more over the coming weeks because there was too many for me to go into in one episode. And, it's always nice to save some for next week. So next week, we're going to talk all about boundaries as a highly sensitive person, which is a huge topic that absolutely needs its own episode. But today we're going to talk a little bit more about how to know if you are a HSP and whether or not you can become highly sensitive later in life. So to answer the first question, what I realized was last week's episode, which was titled, Are You Highly Sensitive? Or Are You a Highly Sensitive Person? I forgot to mention Elaine Aron's self-test, I think. Did I mention that? I don't think I did, which if I didn't, that was a bit remiss of me. But Elaine Aron is she is the person who has done so much of the research into this trait. And on her website, which is HSperson, so HSPERSON.com, she has a bunch of tests, and one of them is a self-test to help determine if you're a highly sensitive person. It's a very well-tested test and very great, but of course it's only part of the way that we could look at, that question of am I a HSP or not. So I'm going to pop a link to that in the show notes, because if you're still sitting there thinking, I don't know, or I want more concrete evidence, I guess, then that is there. So I'll pop that link in the show notes. One of the things, though, I think that's really important to mention if I missed it last week, or to reiterate even if I did mention it, is that when you're a highly sensitive person, it's something that's been true for you pretty well forever. It's something that you're born with. I am mum to a highly sensitive child, and I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt, I've known that he was highly sensitive pretty much from the second he was born. The way that he was as a baby was very evident that he was highly sensitive. You know that if you've listened to this podcast for any length of time, I don't really talk about my kids. I really respect their privacy, so I don't want to go too deeply into that. But I will tell you a little bit about me when I was little. So I was a very fussy baby from my parents, telling me about this later in life. And I really didn't like things to not be the way that I wanted them. My dad tells the story of having to turn the car around multiple times on road trips that we were supposed to be taking because I just couldn't deal. I would just cry and cry and cry. And that's something that wouldn't be uncommon to hear from a parent of a highly sensitive child, or, a highly sensitive adult kind of reflecting on what their childhood was like. Now, this trait was discovered in the late 90s, so you better bet as a 1983 baby, it wasn't something that people really understood. And I have a really clear memory, thinking about how has this shown up over a lifetime. When I was 6 years old, we moved from Canada to Australia, and I didn't want to do it. I was, happy where I was. Thank you very much. And we moved here, and in Canada, the schooling system's different than it is in Australia, naturally. And my age and the month that I was born was such that they had to make a decision whether they would put me in the first grade of primary school, which is prep in Australia, or in Victoria anyway, or whether they would put me in grade 1. So they did some tests, and I remember I simply had to count to 100, and that got me entry into grade 1. Now, the problem was that every single day I cried my eyes out. I was absolutely miserable, and I cried like, I'm not even joking, every day. They had to peel me off my mother. They had to, work pretty hard to get me to settle. And at the time, I remember the principal threatening to put me down a grade if I couldn't kind of pull it together. And so part of the reason I want to tell that story is because I think also highly sensitive people can then learn how to make other people happy by like masking or shielding or protecting themselves from some of their sensitivities. So I don't cry very much anymore. And I actually think it probably stems a lot from that experience and other experiences I had as a kid where it was like your crying makes you unsafe, right? But there are so many examples of things that I could tell you about when I was younger that, in hindsight, it's like, oh, there's the high sensitivity showing up in full force, right? Absolute clarity. High sensitivity doesn't necessarily mean you're introverted though. I was a fairly shy kid, but it doesn't always mean that. There are lots of extroverted HSPs as well. So when you're thinking about, could high sensitivity be a trait that I possess? I mentioned this last week, but it's worth reiterating. I find that when people hear that term, it's kind of like, oh, I think that might be me, right? Because we know that we are heightened in our sensitivity relative to other people. We're also very conscientious and don't want to do the wrong thing. So it's like we probably don't want to grab that label if it's not for us, right? So there's this, and I get that, I hear that. But you probably know if you're highly sensitive is the first thing I would say. But also go take that test because that helps as well. But keep in mind that depending on how you were raised, the beliefs that were kind of instilled in you, some of the things that you might have experienced, you might have suppressed as well. And so you might not score as highly on that test because you've learned to suppress some of those things. And so that's where if you find that your sensitivity is creating some challenges, that you might want support from someone else, a counselor, a therapist, a psychologist, to help you with that and to help you sort of decide, is this a supportive kind of category to put myself in? Because if it's not, no harm done. We want it to be a helpful thing and a supportive thing and something that makes you kind of exhale and say, okay, there's a reason for this. This makes sense. I feel less alone. So now I want to answer the question of like, can you become highly sensitive later in life? And I kind of already alluded to the answer to that. No, not in this context when we're talking about it as a trait. What can happen later in life, though, is that we can become more sensitive because we're under a lot of stress. So that is something that we've all experienced, whether we're highly sensitive people or not highly sensitive people. You layer in a lot of stress onto somebody's life, their sensitivity is going to increase to more stress, right? So we are sensitive to additional load on our system when the load is already high, because we only have the capacity to kind of manage and navigate and hold so much. There's a really wonderful concept called the window of tolerance. And when we are under chronic stress, the level of stuff that we can deal with narrows, right? If we have this window of, I'm fine within this window of kind of arousal and stimulation from the world, the more stress we're under, the smaller that window gets. And so whether you're a HSP or not, stress is going to impact how sensitive you feel. And so if, you're perhaps like, I didn't used to be highly sensitive, but I feel like I am now, I would suggest that it's possibly more of an impact of chronic stress on a system rather than being a trait as such. And so, but this is where, and this is something I've been thinking about this week, this is where it's like the information that's out there for highly sensitive people can be really helpful for non-highly sensitive people too, because at the end of the day, it is self-compassion, kindness, nervous system regulation. It's stuff that we all need. It just happens that often highly sensitive people need a little bit more of it at our baseline because we have already got that heightened sensitivity to stimulus. But it's not like the things that highly sensitive people do are not good for anybody else. They're actually good for everyone because we all have nervous systems and we're all human. So there's that. So I think that that's important to notice. And if you are a highly sensitive person and you are under a lot of stress, then you probably notice your sensitivity goes up, right? You're more jumpy, you're less tolerant of those irritating noises and lights and things that are in your environment. And that is a reminder that, oh, you know, my system is kind of overburdened. I am overwhelmed by internal and external stimulus. And so it's a good clue and a good reminder, I need to tend to my needs because everything that I'm experiencing right now is a, you know, like those big shining pointing arrows saying you need to look after yourself, or you need to be looked after as well. Community is really important too. So at the end of the day, high sensitivity is a nervous system thing. And so if you are under stress, you're going to feel more sensitive, just like our non-HSP friends who are also going to be impacted by that chronic level of stress. All right. That's kind of all I wanted to cover today. A little bit of a shorter one, which is fine. Just a little short episode here and there is not a bad thing. But next week, as I mentioned, I want to dive more into boundaries as a highly sensitive person. Because the thing about being highly sensitive is that when you know, you have a little sense of how other people are feeling and the impact of how what you say, what you do can impact how somebody else feels, it's very easy to start to feel responsible for somebody else's emotions. And so setting boundaries can be really hard because you're like, if I do that, they're going to be mad and I'm going to feel it. And I can control that. I can kind of minimize the impact of that by just not having my boundary. But the person who like loses out on that is always going to be you. And so we're going to talk more about boundaries next week and how we navigate that as a highly sensitive person, because I think it does differ a little bit because we have to take into account sort of this additional knowledge that we have or this additional insight that we have into the impact of what we do, which I think is what can get us stuck in the, I can't do that. So that's going to be next week. But in the meantime, keep sending me your questions. I am absolutely loving them. And I think it's going to give us a really beautiful, well-rounded notion of what it is to be a highly sensitive person. I've also got some episodes coming up with guests who are also highly sensitive people. They're not like immediately in the pipeline, but they're coming soonish. And I wanted to also remind you that the next round of SOMA Home, which if you've been listening for any length of time, you will have heard me talk about that. But if you're new around here, you probably haven't. But the next round of SOMA Home, which is my online small group 6-week program, that was supposed to start in May, which as this goes live, I think it's May now, isn't it? Which is wild. And I've delayed the start date for that because I realized that I want to make that all about being a HSP, which it already is, but I want to tweak it a little bit to make it very, very specific to people with that trait. And so the next round of SOMA Home will probably run either late May, early June is what I'm thinking. And the early interest list for that is already up on my website. It's been up since last round, but it's going to be very targeted at, if you're a HSP in the world, how do we find a sense of home within our own skin? It's the same work that I do with clients when they see me one-on-one for counseling, but applied in a group format and kind of in a more structured way because we're moving through it as a group rather than responding to certain, individual circumstances. So if you're listening and you're like, yeah, I want to dive more into how do I do self-care as a HSP? What do I need to know about this in order to feel more at home and more confident in my own skin? Then that's the program for you unless you want to do it one-on-one, in which case, counselling is the option as well. But I'm going to pop a link to the wait list and the early interest list for the next round because I'm super excited to get that one going, and it's coming soon. So head to the show notes for the HSP Self Test on Elaine's website for information about the next round of SOMA Home. And yeah, until next week, where we talk about boundaries, have a wonderful week. Keep looking after that wonderful, highly sensitive person that you are. And I will look forward to talking to you again really soon.